Hello and welcome to Buy Africa, the show where we focus on investment opportunities around the continent. I'm Tsepo Modiba, and thanks for joining me. Tonight, I'm joined by Ayalanesh Tafese, country risk analyst at Rand Merchant Bank, for a closer look at the economy of Cote d'Ivoire. So we're not talking Nigeria today.
No, another country.
We're going another country.
Yeah.
Let's very broadly speak, what's the current dynamic in Cote d'Ivoire? How is that economy doing? Where are we standing right now?
So I think Cote d'Ivoire has come out as one of the star performers on the continent. A lot of it is really driven by the political recovery that we've seen over the past few years.
Right.
You'll remember the 2011 elections, which were highly contested, very violent, and ended up with the ex-president Gbagbo looking at charges at The Hague.
Yeah.
So since then, I think a lot of the Ivory Coast prospects has been driven by the political situation.
Right.
What we have seen this year, following very peaceful elections in 2015, is the country has been taking very silent but very important steps towards its political reconciliation.
And almost just as importantly, a big rubber stamp from a political perspective on the results. I mean, 83% direction from elections. That's very clear what the population wants.
Absolutely. So not only was the fact that President Ouattara got an 83% was that important, but also the fact that it was not contested and it was not violent. I think
Right.
that was what people were looking at.
Right.
But I think over and above the elections of 2015, I think following the elections, the country has taken very important steps. I think one of the concerns that a lot of investors had was with regards to the opposition party, which was ex-President Gbagbo's party.
Right.
They were worried that going forward, this would be a party that might destabilize the country. But what has happened is they've elected a very pragmatic leader, Pascal Nguessan,
Right.
and he has had a very reconciliatory tone with President Ouattara. They've met up throughout the year and tried to sort of ease tensions between the two parties.
Right.
Another thing that people were watching is, even though President Ouattara has an 83% vote majority, the ruling party is still a coalition between the PDCI and the RDR. And there were some concerns that, maybe we might see tensions between the two parties, we might see them breaking apart or something along those lines. But what is really encouraging is both parties have actually come out and signaled intentions to merge into one party.
Right.
So I think when you put a lot of these things that have been happening very slowly over the past year, these are really steps that will ensure longer-term political stability.
All right, so a lot of the political headwinds are being removed. What does that mean from a policy perspective? What does that mean from a risk perspective on the country going forward?
So I think one of the reasons why Ivory Coast has been seen as a star performer is really a mixture of three things. One of them is the structure of the economy. Okay. Although Ivory Coast is a commodity exporter reliant on cocoa, gold, and even oil, they also have a very strong manufacturing base.
Right.
So manufacturing accounts for around 15% of GDP. And actually, they are the one country in West Africa which actually imports crude oil, refines it, meets its entire fuel need, and actually exports the excess to the rest of West Africa.
Right.
So from a starting base, they're already quite diversified. Then on top of that, you have the currency, which is pegged to the euro and is actually guaranteed by the French Treasury.
Right.
Again, that means currency volatility is not something that you'd worry about, and it also means positive things for things like inflation, especially on imported inflation.
Right.
So you have a very strong base that they're starting off of, and on top of that, the current administration has had a very heavy focus on infrastructure spend, lots of building happening in the country, and the president is an ex-IMF official. You have that confidence coming through from the markets. And on top of that, the policy has really been to crowd in private sector investment.
Right.
So it's very investor friendly. So I think when you mix all these dynamics together, I think that's what makes Ivory Coast stand out.
Certainly one of the more exciting countries on the continent in terms of, as you say, all of these dynamics coming together. And it sounds like the perfect recipe for investors right now.
Absolutely. What is really interesting is Ivory Coast came out, as soon as the elections actually happened, President Ouattara very quickly put together a very technocratic cabinet.
Right.
And one of the first things that they did is to come up with the National Development Plan, which will cover sort of the economic policy over the next 5 years. It is heavily, heavily focused on infrastructure improvement. And a couple of weeks ago, actually, the government went on a roadshow of sorts to speak to donors and to speak to possible investors about buying into this 5-year plan. So I think on day one of the meetings, they met with donors, and donors actually pledged about $15 billion for this plan. It's twice as much as the government had actually expected. So it overshot expectations.
Right.
Private investors have also come in and said they'll put in another 16 billion into this plan.
Right.
So this really lets you know that investors are actually quite positive, and Ivory Coast should really do well, especially when noting that a big chunk of this infrastructure is going to come from concessional lending from donors.
Right. And given the political dynamics right now, there's certainly will to implement it. So again, this sounds very positive in terms of the outlook. Does that mean that the rampant economic growth that we've seen over the last couple of years, we should expect that to continue?
Absolutely. I think if we even take a little bit of a step back, I think a lot of questions that people have in their minds is why all of a sudden as a country in 2011 that was in economic turmoil is progressing so fast. But you need to take a step back and look at the country's history. In the 80s, Ivory Coast was possibly one of the wealthiest countries on the continent. They had gold, diamonds, cocoa output, and I think around the 80s they were seen internationally as the Ivorian miracle, was what they were branded as. Unfortunately, when political problems started occurring in the late 90s and then to the 2000s, what happened is a lot of these businesses just shut down operations. So what you had was a situation where the economy was stagnant because the infrastructure for those businesses and mines were there, they just weren't producing.
Right.
So as soon as the political situation calmed down, what you saw was a ramp up in production. So it wasn't really a question of now we have to put in money to build the infrastructure to get the mine going. The mine was always there. So they just needed to ramp it up. In fact, I think the numbers that have come out from the finance ministry is the fact that gold output in terms of US dollars from the country actually increased by 17% last year.
Wow.
And when you consider that this was a period where gold prices were quite volatile, it lets you know that the amount that they're producing, they've been able to ramp it up quite significantly.
Right.
So the Ivory Coast story is more a story of restarting what had stalled, and I think that is one of the reasons why we're seeing such strong numbers.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. Again, so it means that they've got a leg up on some of their competitors in terms of in the region.
Absolutely.
Going forward, are we likely to see, with this infrastructure spend, more sectors coming on board, or the current sectors thriving?
I think they really are targeting, the gold industry again. As I said, in the late 90s, a lot of these gold mines shut down.
Right.
So there's a lot of focus on getting this restarted. Again, the manufacturing capability is something that they'll keep on building. But another thing that they're actually looking at is things like the stock exchange. So Ivory Coast does have a stock exchange. It's quite small, about 38 companies listed.
Yeah.
But when you think about it, this was a stock exchange that was established in 1998. And they've actually seen quite strong growth. Between 2011 and 2016, trading volumes on that actually trebled.
Right.
So it's something that's actually growing. They've recently been, they are going to be incorporated into the MSCI Frontier Markets Index.
Which will help in terms of boosting volumes.
Absolutely, which will definitely help with boosting volumes. They actually are targeting 20 more listings up until 2020. So there is a lot of drive to improve things in many sectors of the economy.
Which will, again, target the country for foreign investors looking at stock market participation potentially.
Which is great, because I think one of the ways that a lot of people had been investing in the Ivory Coast earlier was through the Eurobond issuances, which were highly oversubscribed. They're currently paying very low yields on them. But outside of that, I think a lot of investors were still nervous. in terms of putting actual infrastructure on the ground. They wanted to test the political stability of the country first before they put actual businesses on the ground. And I think with things like the peaceful elections and that sort of thing, that is slowly building up. Right. But in the meantime, opening up things like the stock exchange will definitely help Ivory Coast bring in much needed money for this very ambitious infrastructure drive that they currently have.
Right. Again, I keep going back. This is a really good story to tell. Beyond the gold sector and manufacturing that you touched on, any other sectors that will benefit from this period?
I think the banking sector is one to look out for. We've already seen traditionally they've been Ivorian banks, but also European banks. It is a Francophone country, so the French do have quite a presence there. What is interesting is we're seeing banks from other parts of Africa actually being interested in the Ivory Coast now. Banks from places like Morocco are currently opening up there. In terms of investment from Anglophone Africa into the Ivory Coast, I think that's something that a lot of banks will have to get their minds around. Right. There are cultural differences, there are business practice differences when you talk about Francophone and Anglophone, but there is definitely interest. So banking is one of the sectors that will also see some growth.
And broadly leverage off the rest of the economy thriving. Again, this is great. So what are the risks associated with the outlook? I mean, a lot of this is positive. What do we need to look out for from an investment perspective?
I think one of the things they really need to watch out for is the accumulation of debt. It's all good and well that you're taking on debt to help with this infrastructure story, but you don't want to do too much too soon. Right. So I think making sure that the debt burden remains sustainable is something that they need to work on. They are lucky in the sense that they have been working with the IMF on this for some time. The IMF is currently in negotiations with them to renew their technical assistance and financial assistance program, so that's very important. But another thing that they really need to look out for is the security environment. Right. It has improved, but there's still many things that they need to look out for. You still have rebels in the north of the country that they need to disarm and reintegrate into the economy. And you also have the recent attacks at Grand Bassam, that holiday resort. Yeah. And why, I think it's very important to dive into why that terrorist attack happened. That terrorist attack happened because Ivory Coast has traditionally been seen as an ally of the West. The French have a base there. Yeah. So the attack in Grand Bassam was not an attack against Ivory Coast, it was an attack against their allegiance to the West. Right. So I think they really need to be careful, especially in that part of Africa where we are seeing increased militancy, especially in areas like Mali and that kind of thing. So they need to be careful about that. It has been encouraging to hear from the United Nations that they plan on staying in the country a little bit longer. Sure. The French, in response to this, have also said they'll be sending troops to help out Ivory Coast with the security situation. So I think security and debt definitely need to be looked at.
Perfect. Let's leave it there. Thanks to my guest, Ayala Nesh Tafesi, Country Risk Analyst at Rand Merchant Bank. That's all from Buy Africa this week. Remember to follow me on Twitter, that's @Mudiba_Tsepo, and send us your thoughts about the show using the hashtag BuyAfrica. For myself and the team, goodbye.